No, absolutely not. Again, I want plans by the many, not plans by the few. I'm not arguing against Mozilla doing something, but that doesn't mean that I don't have the right to suggest that they could do it better. And it also doesn't mean that when I'm expressing this, I may not be expressing it as I am here, a concern that government has essentially forced them or driven them to do things in a way that is suboptimal. In other words, Mozilla could be doing it in a different and better way. And let me go back again to the
I can tell you the FTC is not ordering Mozilla to design their interface.
It's not a question of ordering. See, this was my point earlier by saying that if we look here only for government diktat, explicit orders, we're missing the bigger picture of the more forms of subtle pressure that are brought to bear, especially by our friends over on Capitol Hill, who like to hold hearings to bully companies to do things, sometimes good, and sometimes they end up doing things that are not done in the best way. But let me get back just for a moment to the debate about child safety and parental controls. Nobody is saying in that debate that every single parent everywhere in America should have to come up with a list for themselves of websites that are not appropriate for their children. Instead, we have a system in which parents are given tools that allow them very easily to subscribe to, you might think of them as whitelists and blacklists, that reflect their preferences and that are, say, curated, that's appropriate for a Mormon family or a kid that's between 10 and 13. And that's the kind of thing ultimately that I think makes sense in a world where people are rationally ignorant. We do want to give them simple options. And what I mean by that concretely is it could be a tool that, let's say, the Electronic Frontier Foundation or Chris, because Chris is good at building user empowerment tools, it could be something like that that's offered that says, here are the sites that you should block if you're concerned about companies that have dastardly privacy practices like respawning your cookies and all those sorts of things. That would be a wonderful way to roll this out.
Let me ask you, Andy, where are we at with tracking protection lists? Like, how many are there? What kind of diversity is there right now in the universe of lists that are? I guess the system is shipping with IE9, which a lot of people are getting with their updates right now?
Right, we just shipped that a few months ago, but there are already a number of tracking protection lists on the web. That number continues to grow. We want to see more tracking protection lists, like more. We have a site that aggregates some of them on iegallery.com, and you can go pick from one there.
Say that URL once again.
It's iegallery.com.
Face the microphone and say that URL once again.
iegallery.com.
Thank you, Moderator. This is one of the roles that I play.
But that's just an aggregation site that we put up. Anybody could put up a site that offers any number of tracking protections.
It's reminiscent to me, and I'm really relatively ignorant on this, but it's reminiscent of the spam wars back in the day when you used to have blocking lists for different relays and spam originators. Are there any of those problems emerging in tracking protection lists? Because I could see someone putting out a list that is excessive or that blocks based on controversial reasons and things like that. What's happening in that area?
Yeah, I think that's another reason why having more aggregation sites is a good thing, and definitely we encourage trustworthy entities to do that. There is a risk if you're a user, like you should download a tracking protection list from somebody that you trust. People do trust on the web today. I think that's reasonable, but the more choices that are out there, the better.
I want to go to the economics for a little bit and then talk about vision, but then we'll get to your questions. And so be thinking of questions and be ready to stand on the yay side or boo side. You don't have to commit to one or the other to ask a question, but please, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you made the comparison to spam, because I used to have to download updated spam lists on a regular basis, and now I sign up for an email service, and my email provider automatically scans and erases all the spam messages. Google manages all of that for me. I don't have to enable any preferences. I don't have to enable spam protection. I don't even have to assemble a blacklist. Google does it for me. Now, channeling sort of Berin's argument here, what about the spammers? What about those poor guys selling Viagra who are being denied a living, right? Think of these people who are losing money because they're not able to reach consumers. This is free speech. But no, we've decided that spam protection should be easy to use, and the default should be the one that we think most consumers want.
You don't need to respond. He's made that argument. You've responded to it before. There's
no trade-off there.
That's fine. Let's talk about economics, because we haven't really talked about what advertising supports, and there is an argument that I wrote in my notes to the group that the kinds of questions I would ask are like, Boooh's side Why do you think that the internet is just a tool corporations should use to dine on the entrails of the hapless consumer? Yay side, what did the internet do to you that makes you want to strangle it and drown it in the bathtub? And this is where the economics kick in. Wouldn't cutting back on the advertising business model really wreck lots of the cool free stuff that we get? I don't know why I phrased the question that way, but Boooh side, this is the death of the internet, is it not?
If lots of people make a low-cost opt-out, it would have huge repercussions for the business model that sustains the internet. Information is a non-rival good. Yes, there's a value exchange when you share information about you, but assuming it's not being used to harm you, you're not actually losing anything of value. However, when you pay money to a company to subscribe to their content, you're poorer. You do receive a benefit, but it's not the same economically. So there may be a very good reason, there likely is, for the status quo on the internet where information sharing and advertising is the single biggest source of funding for an array of content and other services that consumers enjoy.
Let me just put that another way. I mean, advertising has always been the mother's milk of media, and it's for the reason that Ryan is getting at in economic terms, which is that basically it's very difficult to get people to fund advertising content by paying for it. Raw information is very difficult to support in that way because, again, it's easily copied. It's rational that you have a business model selling attention next to the content. The problem ultimately here gets down to simple economic analysis. So Ronald Coase, father-in-law in economics, basically taught us that in a world with no transactions cost, so this sort of fantasy land doesn't exist, it doesn't matter where you set opt-in, opt-out, none of those things matter because you end up getting the same outcomes because markets are perfect and they arrive at the same solution. And his point in saying that was markets are not perfect and we have real transactions costs. And so my point in saying this is to say that when you start changing the way that the marketplace works, it's a mistake to assume that, okay, well, you'll have exactly the same amount of funding because people who want to pay for something will provide the same amount of revenue that was otherwise provided by advertising. That's not how it works, right? The reality is building these systems, the explicit quid pro quo of if I say I don't want to be tracked and I prefer to pay and you charge me, building that costs money, you're probably likely to get less revenue. And in the end, it's really not clear how big the effect is going to be, but the stakes are high. And I think that certain people, like Jonathan Mayer, have done a certain disservice here to the stakes by saying, oh, well, behavioral advertising is only $1 billion a few years ago, and it's a $25 billion ad market. Kind of misses the fact that what we're really talking about is display advertising, just about $7 billion. And that behaviorally targeted ad revenue figure is growing quite substantially. So it's not unreasonable to expect that for the next few years we could be talking about a significant percentage of display ad revenue, which is the revenue that websites rely on to fund their operations. It's different from search revenue and other forms of advertising. That's what's at stake here. And again, I worry that the implementation, the particular configuration of do not track and the user interface makes a big difference for those economics. And we don't understand it well, and I'd hate to rush in and lose a lot of the money that funds free content and service.
Yay side, why don't you tell us how overwrought that argument is?
Yes, that argument is overwrought.
Go into specifics.
I guess my difference with Berin here is that I just trust the market more. If you give consumers a choice about whether they want to be tracked without their consent, then there can be a negotiation between the consumer and that publisher or advertiser. And the publisher or advertiser can say, well, let me explain to you the benefits of doing this, and let me explain to you what my practices are. I promise not to use the data in the following 5 ways that you find difficult. And the publisher, the advertiser, has an opportunity to make that pitch to the consumer and to get them to agree that it's worth consenting to the advertisement in order to, or it's worth consenting to be tracked in order to have access to that site. If the consumer feels that it's not worth, if the publisher says, I'm sorry, you're going to have to let me do whatever I want with this data as a condition of visiting the site, the consumer may just go away. The point is that the market can work this out, that there can be, that advertisers will figure out what promises they have to make in order to offer a deal that actually is good for consumers when consumers have the choice. Instead of somebody sitting here on a podium and saying this is a good deal for consumers, we can find out by letting consumers actually choose.
The one interesting thing to think about in that scenario, though, is that then when you visit the Wall Street Journal, they'd have to say, hey, would you mind if we allow 38 different companies to track you while you're here? And that might be a little bit unpleasant for sites to have to admit, what they're facilitating and enabling on their sites. But I do think that, if there's a player that's in a position to give consumers a pitch for enabling these things, it's the ad companies, right? If they can talk you into spending $29.95 for a slanket, or whatever they're showing at 2 a.m. in the morning on TV.
How did you know? How did you know? How did you know?
They can get you. How did you know?
Andy, what do you think of that approach? Can this be bargained out through a do not track mechanism?
I think it has to happen. I mean, the alternative is that, we like it just stays hidden. Like it's out there. People are learning about it, and I think the most important thing is that consumers, when they go do transactions and they do commerce on the internet, that they trust it. So if consumers don't trust the web because they feel like they can't make choices about their privacy, then they won't use it. And then your economic arguments don't work.
One of the things I've heard from the Boooh side that I haven't heard the opposite to on the Yaaay side, Boooh side says no legislation, no regulation, and none of this like arm twisting pressure. But I haven't heard a lot of we need legislation, we need regulation on the Yaaay side. Do we need legislation? Do we need regulation? Do we need arm twisting?
I mean, I think giving more money and more authority to the FTC would be a good thing, but I'm a realist, and I don't think anything's happening in D.C. in the next year or two.
Cash contributions to Ed Felton may be handed over to the program.
I mean, from my point of view, it seems like we've given industry quite a lot of opportunities to try to provide adequate control to consumers, and at this point, I don't believe consumers have that. And so I'm not certain that legislation is the right answer, but I also don't think that self-regulation itself will be sufficient.
Harlan says there has to be regulation. What do you guys say?
Again, I want FTC enforcement, and I think actually one place where I would agree with Chris is that if I remember I asked earlier why the FTC hasn't gone after companies for lying in their P3P policy statements. If that's because they don't have the technical resources and Ed needs more assistance and people like Chris, I'm all in favor of giving the FTC those resources, right? I mean it when I say I'm serious about user empowerment and enforcement of existing laws to start with. And I'm not against do not track in principle. I do have to respond on economics. When Ed says that he trusts the market here, I mean, as a practical matter, I agree that probably that some form of this has to happen. My point, though, is to say that when one says I trust the market, one can mean I trust the market to basically come up with this, the same equilibrium. That's not going to happen because it's costly, right? So, and the extent to which it's costly depends on how many people use this and how it's configured. So once again, I come back to the configuration. If it's a blanket opt-out of everybody, it's going to be more costly and it's going to have a larger effect on revenue than if it were configured in a different way that makes people think a little more carefully, or at least, for example, has the kind of list that I mentioned earlier, where the list that is blocked using the do not track mechanism is a list that's based on some concept of real harm, as determined by our friends at EFF or Chris or whoever else anybody wants to subscribe to, just as I can download the Mormon parental control filter.
I do want to try to preserve debate here, so I wanted to send a question down to Ryan. Ryan, do you support an increase in the FTC's budget for the coming fiscal year?
I support reallocation of resources from the Competition Bureau to the Consumer Protection.
Wow.
I will add that the notion the markets to sort this out is absolutely correct. But when FTC and Congress are talking about we need more privacy, we need do not track, what they're doing is distorting the set of arrangements that would otherwise emerge. In some ways, they're even increasing misinformation among consumers by refocusing the privacy debate to a series of potential risks that really aren't the ones that we should be the most concerned about. They're making markets less effective, not more effective, by being involved. There are good reasons why consumers need more choices, and to the extent that those choices should exist, they are and will continue to emerge over time. The last thing that the companies that make money off the internet want is for consumers to stop trusting the internet and use it less.